Hi, this is Hal Lindsey. As I promised, I'm going to do part 3 of the study on the rapture. Now, in the past 2 messages I've had on the website, I talked about the fact that there are 2 portraits of the Messiah that were predicted in the Old Testament without explanation. Sometimes they were in the same passage together, and in the case of Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2, the first coming about the suffering Messiah and the second coming about the conquering king are in the same sentence, only separated by a comma. Jesus knew about this, and when he returned to his hometown of Nazareth and spoke in his own synagogue, they handed him a scroll of Isaiah, and he read the passage from Isaiah 61, and he came to a certain point, and where it said to explain the acceptable year of the Lord, which was the point where the prophecy about the suffering Messiah ceased, and the next part of that sentence talked about things the Messiah would do in his second coming as the great conquering king. So he read up until that point, and he stopped right in the middle of a sentence. And he rolled up the scroll and handed it back to the keeper of the law, and he said, "This day, this scripture has been fulfilled in your ears." You see, he knew that there were 2 portraits there, and he stopped when the first portrait was presented. And he realized that if he had read on, he couldn't have said, "This day has this been fulfilled in years." But up until that comma, the scripture had been fulfilled because he was coming as the suffering Messiah. And yet, in the Old Testament, both are painted there. No explanation, as I said. And of course, it was very, very difficult for an Old Testament believer to be able to explain how both of these can exist. Why a suffering Messiah and why a conquering king? How do they relate together? Are they both the same person, or are they 2 persons? Well, these are all questions that were studied, debated, and talked about, and written about, and everything else, until finally, about 300 or so years before Jesus came, the rabbis projected a theory that there must be 2 messiahs coming. One will be the suffering servant, the other one will be the conquering king, because they couldn't reconcile that both of them could be the same person. Nor could they explain, was there going to be coming at the same time, or was there going to be a distance between those 2 portraits being fulfilled? They didn't know. Now, I take all of that in because a lot of people say, well, trying to go through the scripture and discern where Christ is going to come secretly for the church and where he's at the end of this period known as the tribulation, he's going to come back to the earth and set up a kingdom that'll last 1,000 years. It just seems too complicated. God wouldn't do that. Well, he certainly did it in the Old Testament. It was complicated. It wasn't explained. And I believe it's an exact parallel. You see, today, scholars for the last 250, 300 years have been really trying to piece together 2 explanations of a coming of Christ that are different. They couldn't both be the same coming. And that's what I want to talk about today. There's a timeline that we know has been set up in the Bible. First, there was Israel under the law, and then when the Messiah came as the suffering Messiah and was rejected, Israel was set aside, and as Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27 had predicted, they were going to put the Messiah to death, and then after that there was going to be a Holocaust It says the city and the temple will be destroyed, and it will be destroyed by a prince who is to come later, the coming prince. And so when Jesus came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, as it's called, as he was predicted to do in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, he came in riding on a donkey with a donkey's colt alongside. He presented himself exactly as predicted. He, for the first time, openly allowed himself to be proclaimed the Messiah, the Son of God. And then he was officially rejected. The moment he was rejected, the allotment of time that Daniel had given the Israelites to fulfill the purpose for which he had called them was stopped. That allotment of time was 490 years. But it was stopped 7 years short. After 483 years, exactly the timeline that Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27 said would happen. And so the clock was stopped. It has 7 years of allotted time for Israel still remaining on it. But he said there were going to be 2 historical events that would come after the clock was stopped. After the 69th sabbatical year and before the 70th sabbatical year. So the first thing he says, the Messiah shall come and be cut off and have nothing. Cut off is a colloquial saying for put to death in Jesus' day. So less than a week after he was rejected, Jesus was put to death, exactly as predicted. And then 37 years after that, the people of the prince who would come destroyed the city and the sanctuary. And as Daniel said, the end of that would be, until the end, there would be continuous conflict and war over the land of Israel and Jerusalem. That has been fulfilled to the T. 70 A.D., the Romans came. They destroyed the city and the sanctuary. They scattered the Israelites over all the world. Every country had some of these refugees show up eventually. And so we see that there was a parenthesis that had to exist between the end of the 483rd year when Jesus was rejected and up until the remaining 7 years, the 70th sabbatical year, would start. And verse 27 says that will not start until the Antichrist comes and signs a covenant of protection, a covenant that will guarantee Israel's security. Once he signs that covenant with the nation of Israel in the last days, that officially starts the clock again, counting down the last 7 allotted years of Israel. Now, the main thing that Israel was called for was to be a witness to the existence of the true God. They were to receive and write down the written revelation about God so that the world that's in darkness would have a way of knowing and understanding God and finding their way to Him. They were also to be evangelists. They were supposed to present God to the nations around them that had pushed God away long ago in their culture. And they were to be a witness to them of the blessing and salvation that came from their God. That they terribly failed at. They excluded Gentiles from their presence. Far from becoming witnesses to them, they isolated themselves from them. God said don't be like them, but He didn't say isolate themselves completely from them. They were to take the message to them. So, in that last 7 years that's allotted to them, they are going to have to do something they've not done. And the book of Revelation, chapter 7, explains it to us. Because it says, immediately after the church